WNST, Towson, our friends at Howard Bank, a relentless commitment to being the best at everything they do. Branches throughout Baltimore and Maryland. I'm wearing the hat on the old WNST Facebook Live and the YouTube camera. Also brought to you by Royal Farms, real fresh, real fast, the tasty coffee, the Kona blend in my cup, and of course the best fried chicken in the land. Make sure you're using the Rofo app. Get the points, get the rewards, and get the Western fries for free. This should be the chunkiest, coolest segment that I have of the week. One of our defending champions and probably secretly my favorite guest to have on the program because we work at a different wavelength because he helped build the Baltimore Orioles and, well, you know, I'm responsible for wrecking them, apparently. Marty Conway is here. He is the good Georgetown professor and the longtime executive with the Baltimore Orioles in the 80s and, of course, the Texas Rangers. And you can follow him out on Twitter, many do, as well as on LinkedIn, where he doesn't blog often enough. And I don't know, Marty, that we could talk about the Capitals and what's going on with them business-wise or with the NBA and certainly the back end of the Masters and the NFL. And we've talked about all that, but I just want to focus on baseball here because so many are. And, you know, everywhere from Forbes to Sports Illustrated, people are writing about what's gone on with attendance being down, not just in Baltimore, but kind of everywhere, and the netting and TV and all the other sports principles that are sort of folding into empty stadiums here lately. And I know you've had a lot to say on Twitter and on social media about baseball here the last couple of weeks, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're looking at, in a lot of, you know, both as an industry, they're looking at some record gaps, record issues going back to 2007 was the last time you had, you know, this many postponements and all of it kind of that goes with it. And then, of course, the local story of, you know, is there a rotation here going on? Is there a change in terms of the ownership and decision-making and all that? So I think there's plenty there to consider for sure.
Color this for me because, and I, you know, you've been in the middle of this, yep. And I remember being at the Baltimore Sun the day the AS Able company sold to Times Mirror, and my boss Jack Gibbons called me and said, and I'm 18 years old. I didn't even know what that meant. You know, I didn't understand a change in philosophy. And I think a lot of people around here, when it comes to the Ravens and Ozzie Newsome, this is the time of the year we're talking about the draft and who's making the decisions. I have found it maddening. I mean, absolutely maddening as doing this for 27 years, 25 of it now under Peter Angelos, that people have had different standards for the football team and the baseball team. And obviously down in D.C., they have 4 teams down there with different expectations for the Redskins, the Caps, the Wizards, and the Nationals. But here it's been the Orioles and the Ravens for now a generation, a quarter of a century. And I find it fascinating where baseball has been for who has to answer for the questions and the decisions that are made. And it sort of feels like all of it over 25 years has led to baseball games where we have 2,500 people. I mean, it's not just the weather. It's not just the location. It's not downtown. It's not that the average fan's 57. It's not that kids are free or aren't free. It really is sort of 25 years of all of this, and the changing of the guard means so much. It meant so much for Rocky Wirtz in Chicago, but you've been through this. I mean, you went through this with the Orioles where things changed a little bit. Then they changed a lot of it. You went to Texas where things changed. Tell everyone what that's like when you've been in the building trying to keep one person happy and keep one family happy, and now things are changing. And it really creates some sort of internal chaos in most situations because people don't know where to run or hide in a lot of cases, right?
Yeah, well, the one thing so there's 2 things about it. Number one is that in the loss of certainty can be frustrating for people who come to rely upon certainty. They want to show up every day and sort of know what to expect and then go home and know what they could expect the next day. And change can be really difficult for a lot of people. So those sort of things go hand in hand. And when I was in Baltimore, we went through the change of, you know, Edward Bennett Williams passed away, and it was a question of where the club would go for a period of time. And then Eli Jacobs bought the team, and he never really was able to firmly hold it because of his strained financial issues. And so there were always rumors and discussions. In fact, I left just before, I think actually the team went into debtor's court, I think just before I left. So I was there sort of for 2 different types of that. And like I said, look, these are by and large, these are folks who go into work every day like any other office and expect continuity. And when that doesn't happen, if you go to work for BG&E or Constellation or M&T Bank or anybody else like that, you don't expect change very often. In fact, if ever, new management might come in, but generally the philosophy stays the same. That all changes when you go through, whether it's change from one owner or the other, or to different family members. And so I suspect that there is a combination of speculation, there's a combination of uneasiness, and then just, what is the plan? And we're going to talk in a few minutes, I'm sure, about what we've seen so far attendance-wise. But it's very clear that the lack of attention to the corporate market, to the group market, to the sort of the markets of Baltimore has really taken hold here on season ticket attendance and all the other corporate revenues, which I've believed for many years now have cost them the difference between $5, $10, $15 million a year that could be used in payroll because they just don't have the certainty of upfront revenues.
Well, and then part of that is winning, right? And when you get off to this kind of a start, everything becomes affected, other than, quite frankly, bobblehead night, discount nights, the day I got to take my kid out there because it's, they want the giveaway item or whatever. And I know they've been very, very aggressive, and you and I have talked about that. The one thing that really disappeared in the 90s was all the giveaways went away because you had 3.6 million people paying full price. They didn't have to worry about any of that stuff. And scalp-free zones outside and all of that nonsense. And now I really felt very Expos-esque last week. Like, it's really the first time, and I know you and I have chatted privately over lunch about this, and I think I started to talk about this out loud over the last year, starting first with private conversations, but I'm a little worried about where all this is going, bro, and I'll say this. I think John Angelos is a little bit, but only as worried as a kid who's about to inherit, $1.5 billion with his brother, and I don't think John Angelos should ever have to worry about where his next meal is coming from once this thing is sold off. But if you're trying to operate it and you're trying to run it as the Baltimore Orioles in 2020, 22, 25, 28, 30, which ain't that far off, man. I did Free the Birds in 2006, and that feels very fresh to people, but that was 12 years ago. So, put your little, Charles Dickens pattern on and go 12 years ahead and tell me where we're going to be in 2030, because something, somebody, some person, some entity is going to have to come in here and infuse something that has nothing to do with Boog Powell. And quite frankly, probably, Marty, not much to do with Cal Ripken, right? Who just wants to be left alone, sell off his cottage, go down to Annapolis, and not sell roast beef sandwiches and not really be into this. So Brooks ain't coming in a horse to save this thing. Palmer's not saving this thing. Who is going to be the Kenny Cooper? I always use that example. Who's going to come in here and fly the flag and be the guy who Justin Trudeau's this and shakes hands, makes friends, resells baseball to a market that's more lacrosse, resells coming into a city that has had tremendous white flight and fear, and a fan base that is deteriorated? I mean, I worry for the Ravens. And I would say this to Bisciotti or Kevin Byrne or, anyone on the business side, Brad Downs. I really worry about who's going to be sitting in that seat next. Not just for you, but for me. Because I'm 50 years old this year, and I have a sports entity here, and I feel like sports is deteriorating a little bit, and someone needs to come in and reinvigorate that in some sort of Ray Lewisian, Cal Ripke, Johnny U. Bro, I don't know where that's coming from, but it's probably not coming from Joe Flacco anymore. It's probably not coming from John Harbaugh. Maybe it comes next week on draft night. But from the Orioles' perspective, it's not Manny Machado either. Throwing $300 million at Manny Machado didn't help you sell any tickets last week. So I really do feel like what is going to be that tipping point, that thing, and John Angelos all of a sudden is talking to Jeff Passan. Not to me, but he's talking to the national media now and espousing liberal politics, which I certainly gravitate to. I have a whole lot more in common with him than I do with Donald Trump, but I don't know how that's going to sell either, Marty. I mean, I often wonder. So, where do you see this? Who's going to save them and help them sell tickets other than themselves, where they just think, well, we'll win a few games and people will come? They've been winning. They've been winning, and their fan base has not grown. That's a really, really disturbing thing when you've been to the ALCS, and you've had a pretty good product the last 5 years, right?
Yeah, so on a macro level, and again, we talked about this, we'll continue to talk about this, the relationship of the fan to the live event, everything from how they purchase tickets, how they resell tickets, how they get there, how they get home, all those things have changed at a pace that no one anticipated. Things were evolving at 2 or 3 or 4 miles an hour for several decades. And then that changed, everything from secondary ticketing opportunities to all kinds of other things have changed. And so it's confusing to people. And here's why that matters. When people are confused, they tend to hesitate in how they make purchases. They wait, or they decide at the last minute and other things like that. And so what you can see through the first 6 home games that they've had in the attendance that they revealed, that first Monday game they had against, I think it was Toronto, where they announced an attendance of 7,900 people. That's by rule. Major League Baseball requires that you announce tickets sold, not actually people in the ballpark. I think we all know that. But here's what that tells you. Because on a Monday night when it was cold and damp and others, you're pretty sure that they didn't have any walk-up tickets that night. Maybe a few here and there, but nothing of consequence. Also, Monday nights are nights where there's probably no mini plan as a part of that stack. So what I just said there was, you look at the stack of how tickets are put together. At the base layer, you have the full season ticket plan, right? All 81 games. This would include people sitting in the lower deck. This would include people sitting in sky suites or things like this.
Marty, isn't that relegated now just to companies and a lot of ticket brokers in a lot of markets, right? That's a big part of buying, to being a ticket broker, literally, right?
Yeah. So that's what I call the base layer. And then on top of that, you would lay mini plans on a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, group tickets, promotional nights, other things like that. And that vertical stack is how you would make up your total attendance. I think the key thing in Baltimore that I read, and when I compare it to Washington, because the Nats were home that night as well, was that the announced crowd in Baltimore was 7,900. The announced crowd in Washington was 19,000. Now, they're going to host the All-Star game. They've got a number of other things that sort of turbocharge their corporate relationships. And so if Baltimore is below 8,000, you're getting into territory of Tampa Bay, Miami, Oakland, places like that where you just aren't having the corporate relationship that is investing every year and buying season tickets. In fact, you're likely eroding that. So what does that mean? That means you have to turn around and go into the game day market, which is then subject to other people's plans, their kids' games, vacations, weather, all kinds of issues, all things that are going around town that might conflict with you buying a ticket. The other thing is you don't buy in advance, and so you wait to see certain circumstances occur. That kind of spiral has been happening in Baltimore, I've thought, for a number of years. But now I think last week you really saw the numbers to indicate sort of where that is. Now, what do you do about that? That's an incredible rebuilding. You got to rebuild confidence. You got to build relationships with people who are willing to invest in your business 40 times a year, 80 times a year, buy a luxury suite. And I think all those things that you talked about, the swirl of Baltimore, the marketplace, the conditions, crime, safety, all those things sort of crystallize. And it's going to take an outsized personality continuously to come into the market or be part of the market and rebuild that coalition, is what I call it, that coalition that has made Baltimore sports really powerful and popular, because you're not just investing in the team, but you're investing in that person who you are confident in and that you're willing to transfer your money to their pocket because you think it's in the best interest. Now,
well, wasn't that a wonderful part of Chuck Thompson and John Miller and, having Charlie, whoever it was? I mean, and even Brooks, for 20 years after he wasn't playing, was that there was this association that you felt on your stoop in Highland Town or your country club, up in Ruxton, wherever you were, you felt aligned. Man, that's gone, man. That goodwill has been burned over and over again by people like me for 25 years. I don't know where that's going to come from, where they're going to get people interested in a sport that moves as slow as baseball moves, that's become a lot more expensive than going to a movie, quite frankly, Marty.
Yeah, so over that time, you mentioned the winning from 2012 through 2016, et cetera. They actually backslid from 2014 down to 16 by a couple 100,000 people. Now, again, I think the interest is clearly there in the support and the enthusiasm, but it's making the connection and making that transition to actually investing in the team through those things. I would say this with some degree of confidence that as you look on the ring of luxury suites at Oriole Park and Camden Yards, that probably half of them are fully sold at this point. And maybe of those half, only some percentage of them are actively used very often. So what happens is you built all those suites 25 years ago, and this is part of what my responsibility was then. You were projecting into the market. If you were to do that today, you would have to take 1/3 of that inventory out and just say that market doesn't exist in Baltimore, Washington anymore because the Nationals have taken some percentage of that, and then look what's happened sort of in the Baltimore metro area. And that's going to have to be replaced with some other type of seating, entertainment, something like that gives people an option. Companies might buy 5 suites a year in order to give, but it's a really difficult challenge and a really difficult sell. And so what they've done is they've turned and said, yeah, okay, we've got kids free and we've got promotional nights and we've got all these other kinds of things, which is another way to build that stack. It's just that you're missing such a key element to what makes baseball in particular that relationship. And even when Ed Williams or some other people were owning the team and weren't there necessarily, it was people like Larry Lucchino and others who knew everybody in the community, or they knew Larry, or somebody like
somebody that. Has to do that. Somebody has to be the maitre d'. Somebody has to be the wine person. Somebody has to be out in front of it and live here in the off season and not put the bird head on and run around and tweet at the Kidney Foundation. Somebody needs to be out on the front getting you excited about coming down and going to a ball game. I mean, that's there are too many other things to do in this world at this point.
Yeah, and especially, like I said, given the conditions that have changed around the ballpark in the last 3 to 5 years, I believe fully, and then you've got to get out in the community. You've got to go where those folks are. You've got to be at the local events or the weekly events or the monthly events that occur, because that's where, look, Baltimore is a complex community. You've got east, west, north, south. Every component of it is different, and I think actually requires sort of a different strategy. If you're talking to people in Highlandtown and others in Essex, that's a completely different set of talking points and views. If you're in other parts, if you're in northern Baltimore County, place like that, that's a whole different scenario too. So it's going to take, I think, sort of a consortium of individuals, perhaps, in order to bring that back when and if that decision is made, however it's made, because it's pretty complex. Now, I know that the Orioles have recently made some quietly and are trying to still make some new additions. I think they're trying to supplement the staff that has been almost decimated. At least they haven't added people on the business side for half a decade. And so there's a real need to do that. But the real work is out there in the community, building relationships with corporate and investment types who would be willing to be a partner of it. And to this point, the one thing that you can say about the ownership of the club to this point locally is aren't really interested in partnerships. I mean, that's just not what Peter G. Angelos did. He didn't take partners in his law firm. He didn't do deals, kind of things like that. And so as a result, over time, I think that has reflected into the relationship with some of the key folks in town, especially new people coming in town, and that's their challenge. So the numbers are plain to see now. I don't think, I will tell you, I've always said, I don't think Baltimore will ever draw less for the Orioles than $1.7 million. It will never go lower than that. In the depths of time in 1988, that's what we drew. And if you look back at some of the lean times at Oriole Park at Camden Yards, it was around 1.7. So I think that's probably the floor. What the ceiling is now, they got up to 2.4. So somewhere in that range, it looks like, is where they could, and that's a big difference in revenue between 1.7 million people coming in and 2.4 million. That's how you can fund consistently to compete with Boston, New York, and Toronto, and the other people that are going to spend big.
He is our professor of sports business around these parts at Georgetown University. He is Marty Conway, former executive with the Baltimore Orioles as well as the Texas Rangers. He gives us a great look at the business of sports around here. All of it brought to you by our friends at the Maryland Jockey Club. Laurel's running this week, the Tessio this week. They call that the Preakness Prep. And, of course, they'll be moving from Laurel to Pimlico next month after the Kentucky Derby. Jen and I are going to spend Derby Day down at Laurel on the 5th. And then, of course, we'll be at the Preakness at Old Hilltop on the 19th. The entries now in the WNST morning newspaper. That brought to you by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com. We deliver that digitally to you at 7 a.m. each and every morning. And, of course, on the front of WNST.net as well. Also brought to you by our friends at Pizza John's. I was there last Saturday. Luke likes the meat sauce. I prefer the tomato sauce. Either way, get a cheesesteak, get a meatball sub. At some point, I'm going to get the ravioli. Pizza John's, back River Neck Road in Essex. 50 years they've been doing it down there. Want to remind everybody about our Thursday series for charity and community. It's all brought to you by Howard Bank, as well as our friends at Cole Roofing, and Billy Cole's going to join us as well. Each and every Thursday, we chat with 501c3s, local communities, charities doing good work in our community and spotlighting that work. And if your charity needs to be involved, just throw me a note, nasty@WNST.net. I have some openings through the spring and summer. I'm booking ahead these days. Marty, this week, the Yahoo.com sports leader Jeff Passan, great baseball author, been on the program before. We've talked to him. Managed to get John Angelos on the phone. And, you know, John has done 3-4 things a year, going back to the riots, where he talks to somebody about something. Usually it's somebody in New York or somebody in Nashville, in and around country music, or in and around, a business sector in New York. But this was, all about the free tickets for the kids. And I want to read you this quote, and I want you to react to this because, I always said to my wife, and over the last 10, 12 years, I'm like, I wonder where they would be if all of this television money just didn't fall off the side of a truck. And they had to actually go out and sell things because they've never really done that here, the Angelos family. The quote from John is, when a sport says every year we're now at $8 billion, $9 billion, $10 billion, how did the league or industry get there? I'll tell you how baseball didn't get there, by raising the number of people walking in through the door. And for that quote to come out after seeing Expos crowds here last week, part of the dirty little secret, Marty, is they're making a lot of money even when the place is empty. And to some degree, that's sort of, its own enemy now, isn't it? That when you can be lazy and still print money, as they've done around here the last 15 years to a large degree, they haven't had to go out and bootstrap. They don't even know what that's like, Marty. You do.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. No, from firsthand, hand-to-hand combat, getting into people's offices and getting them excited about a relationship with a club and a relationship with ownership, and visits from ownership and acknowledgments and all those kinds of things. Those go hand in hand. But I didn't see the quote. That's the first time I'm talking about. But regardless, I don't know the motivation of that. But I can tell you that empirically, this is clear, that if you look at the top 1, 2, and 3, and even now 4 buckets of revenue regarding sports, there's all kinds of consultant reports on this and plenty of research, that the revenue from live gate continues to step down from 2 decades, 3 decades ago of it being number 1 to then becoming number 2 to now moving into number 3. And all that same time, you're seeing media revenues continue to grow from 4th most important to 3rd to 2nd to now number 1. And that's not going to change because the sport industry has become so synonymous with the growth of, at this point, to television, and we'll see what happens in digital, but they were almost coterminous in that regard, okay? So it made perfect sense. Those were two industries that had very similar objectives. They were funded by advertising and third-party revenues, and so it's happening. And so revenues from live gate continue to step down. Now, the reality of that is that in both the NFL and Major League Baseball, the teams that do better in the live gate, those are, again, we can go through the whole complication of what revenues you share and what revenues you don't. But generally speaking, those live gate revenues are the difference between whether it's your profit and loss or your profit and more profit or putting it into salary cap revenue, whatever you want to put it into, stadium improvements, whatever. So it's always been incumbent upon owners to maximize that revenue opportunity, even though in terms of scale, it continues to step back. So it's not something that's been ignored. I would disagree with that aspect of it. It's the evolution of the sport industry and what revenues are in that stack and in what order. Now, it's important for each team owner to recognize this is our responsibility here in Baltimore. It's not Major League Baseball's responsibility to generate local revenues for all 30 clubs or the NFL for all 32 clubs. That's why you award a franchise to ownership, to families, et cetera, because you say you're going to operate in your best interest in that local market. And so if those numbers are stepping back on a local basis, well, then guess what? In Washington, they're not. In Washington, they're stepping forward because they aggressively went after the All-Star game. They're getting it this year, July of 2018. The Orioles were in a perfect position to get it in 2016. And with the dispute between Masson, the Orioles, and Major League Nationals and Major League Baseball said, no way, no how. And so as long as that stalemate continues, the All-Star game, which is an incredible driver for both corporate relationships and season tickets, it manifested itself on Monday night a couple of weeks ago where the Nats announced 19,000 and the Orioles announced 7,900. And so, you know, there's the dichotomy. However somebody feels about what the Major League Baseball's obligation is to do, they're going to look at that and say, that's your market, pal. I mean, take care of it, do what you need to, because it's in your economic interest to draw people into. And now I see that one of the ways that they're going to bat it is to, you know, make a very generous offer to allow kids in free. But generally speaking, Nestor, baseball has not been a market that's been economically impacted by price because there's so many games and dugout clubs and 2-for-1s and everything else that generally speaking, getting a kid into the baseball game at a reasonable price when you can bring your own food hasn't been a big objection for people. I think it's a great soundbite and I think it's a great headline, but ultimately you got to do the work in getting people to buy tickets to multiple games, to 30 games, to 13 games, to 40 games, or whatever it is. And that comes down to corporate relationships, and we'll see what happens here in the market in the future.
Yeah, Marty, it is interesting maybe 10, 12 years ago when the team really stunk and hit rock bottom, and I'm on the radio for the 10th year talking about it, kind of pissed off and angry, as I get even when I think about what the Orioles used to be and what they've become. And, I am sort of heartened if John's a different guy and going to be the Rocky Wirtz of this thing, because those stories are legend, and it is pretty legendary that he and his father have never seen eye to eye much, and that's one of the reasons a 50-year-old guy who's been around for 25 years isn't running the team on a day-to-day basis and has sort of, I guess, usurped that now that his father's in failing health. And I don't hear much from Lou, but let me read you another quote here. And anybody can go and read this. It's out at Yahoo. Jeff Passan, Passan, wrote the piece. It's about the zero price for the kids. He says, John Angelos, if you want to be in touch with the consumer, the fan that pays the bills, it's always price and value received. It's really not a debate. If the audience thinks that they're getting a good price value, then they are. If they don't, then they're not. You can't spin that. You can't press release your way out of that. You can't argue with people and tell them, no, it's really worth it. They either think it is or it's not. And I would take what you had just said to me about always being able to get a kid in for cheap and being able to take your family. Bro, I completely agree with that through the history of baseball. baseball. Up until, I don't want to say now would be different, but it is $23, $25 most nights just to walk in there and walk around. And I've noticed that around 5 years ago, I could take you to Yankee Stadium and get a ticket on StubHub for $3, $4, $5. Those days are gone. And I would say that 10 or 12 years ago, the thing that really disturbed me when the place was empty in the bad years was that it really was cheap. It really wasn't about $5, $6, bargain basement night, whatever. It's, do you want to come to the game or do you not at any price? Would you be willing to come if it were free? And the answer 10, 12 years ago was no. Like, most people didn't want to come for $5. Now it's $20, which I'm 2 blocks away. It's a hell of a lot more of a decision at $20 or $22 or $24, even with a bobblehead or whatever they're going to give me, a hat, whatever, than it was when it was $6 or $8 a couple of years ago. And I know that they've done away with that really bottom tier thing that Peter didn't like bargain night anymore, but yet they're letting the kids in for free. So I find that I want to see what John is going to do when Peter isn't looking over his shoulder, which apparently beginning right now, like literally from here moving forward, I can never blame any of this on the old man anymore. Future decisions I'm talking about, because he's not going to be making any more of those. And I think that unto itself is just an incredibly monumental thing, No,
you're right about that. I mean, I believe this is a point of no return where, this decision for whatever reasons, health-wise or other issues, has been made. And these are most times, unless people come out and say specifically, they're irreversible, and it usually sets off a period of uncertainty, and then you have to see kind of what happens, whether there's another shoe to drop, so to speak. But as I said earlier, look, all of this sounds interesting, and it sounds, kind of consumerism happening there. But at the end of the day, when it comes to there is no shortage of baseball in this region, okay?
Sure.
There are more than 6 million people attending a baseball game in and around the state of Maryland. If you take the Orioles, you take Washington, D.C. and the Nats, you take the minor league teams and the independent teams that make up baseball in the area. I did this calculation about a year and a half ago, and there were more than 6 million tickets sold to baseball in the state of Maryland. There's no, in the surrounding region, there's no lack of interest in baseball, and there's plenty of it available. The question is, what is your relationship with the key stakeholders that are part of that? Like I said, whether you take corporate relationships, whether you take baseball fans, hardcore fans, casual fans, kids, females, all in it, and put that together. Ultimately, the best organization wins. So the best organization draws the most. If that organization happens to be in Bowie or Frederick or downtown Baltimore or downtown Washington, D.C., that's where people go, right? So everything else is just sort of throwing things to the wind and making a good soundbite and making a good impression. But the day-to-day work is done at the local level, where you're building relationships with people that are lasting, so that it's not just a sign in the outfield, but it's a sign in season tickets and involvement and promotion and all those kinds of things. That's where it's built. That's what has decayed in Baltimore, in my view, certainly in the last 5 to 10 years. It was revived briefly by sort of a flurry of winning up through 2012 and 2014, but you can see that underlying they weren't doing the work, because from 14 to 16, they should have had some increases or only small steps down, and they lost about 400,000 people out of the ballpark. So, in terms of tickets sold, so that, I think those are the analytics that sort of are up against sort of the narrative and the quotes and other things that are out there. It's really, are you willing to do the work? Are you willing to scale the organization to be able to meet it? And that's the same thing for whether you're the Ravens or the Orioles. When these things start to slide and they go in that direction and they go in that curve to the left, you've got to scale in order to accommodate that and get ahead of it. Because, as I said, the very first part of our conversation, the pace of change now is not 2 or 3 miles an hour a year. It's probably double that per year in terms of how people get access to tickets, whether they want to go to live events, and what all of their other choices are, including staying home to watch it on TV.
He is Marty Conway. You get that wisdom out on his Twitter as well as on LinkedIn. He is the good professor at Georgetown University for all things sports and business, sometimes on a camel in Qatar, and sometimes just like hanging out at a Wizards playoff game or something like that. And certainly it has been a very, very active time. Man, we haven't had a chance to talk Caps, Wizards, Redskins, Nats, Ravens, any of the other stuff, but I do appreciate the deep dive into the baseball thing, and I do really find this, and I'm writing about it right now, to be monumental. It's a real period, as you said, of uncertainty. Rosenthal called it upheaval, and I'm calling it literally, and you can quote me on this out on the internet, Marty, a time of judgment and observation. I'm just observing what's going on because it ain't ever going to be the way it was anymore. It's going to change. I hope you feel like it can't get any worse, but I don't know. That's up to John Angelos and Lou Angelos and Mama Angelos as to how they're going to embrace this thing, right?
Yeah, no, the notion that running it not just like a business, not just like a family business, and not just like a baseball club, but looking at the context of what you're competing against, including downtown Washington, D.C., and every place else, and literally having the courage and the investment to do that and to build around it, because if you don't, someone else is going to. This franchise eventually will come into the hands of someone else. It's bound to. We're currently at roughly 25 years since the current ownership has purchased the team, and no ownership prior to, since the Orioles came in 1954-55, nobody owned it for more than 25 years. So I actually think that circulation of ownership for local franchises is good. I would say the same thing about the Ravens and the Orioles and anybody else, because it brings new blood, new ideas, and sort of a fresh perspective. And there's not that many organizations in sports that have been successful over the long term, even though they've stayed in the family hands for an extended period of time. There's just a curve that happens where it's good for a long time, and then when it's not good, it's very difficult for them to get out of it without bringing in new investment, new partners, things like that. So we're at the 25-year mark roughly. I could see this thing becoming, a change over the next 1 to 3 years, and probably for the better for the marketplace, because it would just reinvigorate everybody, from fans to media to investors to corporate sponsors and everybody else.
Well, they throw that word community around all the time, and I never forget that they refused to put Baltimore on the jerseys for a long, long, long time. And then they came back with their arms open and find out that, only 2,100 people want to go there and sit on a Monday night. So, Marty, I'm sure we'll talk more about this, moving forward. I didn't even get to the part where their number one marketing asset, quite frankly, is the television station they have. And I can't think of anything that does a worse job of marketing their product. Just in a general sense, that's their number one asset, as I see it, is the games themselves and the presentations. And they don't really make you want to run back out to the ballpark. They really don't.
No, if you stack it up against Nesson and SNY and Fox and Comcast and others, it's a pretty parochial effort. It's generally been the same now. So you're right, it's the number one engine. But if you're not going to put games additionally free over the air like opening day, or you're going to limit your spring training games, TV is a declining asset, even though it's your number one asset. Fewer and fewer people actually take cable, but while you have it, you need to maximize it. And they've got some challenges that they haven't confronted or overcome yet.
Marty, love you, appreciate you. Thanks for all the time today, man. Great chat. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Deep Dive with Marty Conway of Georgetown University. All of it brought to you by our friends at the Baltimore Brigade. They play at home on the 28th. That's next Saturday against the Albany Empire. Got a big win over Washington to start the season. The Philadelphia Soul also in that league. Go to BaltimoreBrigade.com to learn more, as well as the Monumental Sports app. You download that. You can use it for all sorts of stuff, but especially for Brigade games and watching those games on the fly, where the Arena Football League action provides tons of touchdowns for you. The Modal Lyric is our partner. I want to remind everybody, Britt Floyd playing the music of Pink Floyd on April 26th. We'll be telling you more about that, and Damian Darlington from that band joined us to talk about his love of the music of Pink Floyd. Also, Jackson Brown on May 3rd, Kansas, Steely Dan coming later on in the year, as well as William Shatner. The Modal Lyric, now our partner at WNST.net. Want to remind everybody out there about Freedmont Mortgage. Don't make a 30-year mistake by choosing the wrong lender. You need the right lender. You need Carl Delmont and our friends at Freedmont Mortgage. Buying, selling, maybe just in the market to learn a little bit more, you can learn a lot about it out on their website at Freedmont.com. Nasty at WNST.net finds me. We're on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live on our Facebook, as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.